Hello and welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and I'm so excited. Today is our second episode of Colorado's Election Watch. That's hashtag CO Election Watch. If you have any questions for our candidates, I have in studio with me Ed Sealiver with Denver Business Journal. How are you doing today, Ed?
Good. Thanks for having me back, Alex.
Yes, of course. And I have on the phone with me Covert President Jeff Wasden. How's it going, Jeff?
It is absolutely wonderful. Excited about this series and excited to talk to our second candidate for state treasurer of the state of Colorado.
Yes, we also have with us in studio Dave Young. He is the Democratic candidate for state treasurer. How are you doing on this lovely Friday afternoon?
I'm doing well, Alex and Jeff. Thanks for having us. Ed, always good to see you, so thanks for having me here.
Yes, of course. Well, I'm going to let these guys take it away. They know what they're doing, and they're awesome at it.
So. All right, good.
You might be giving us way too much credit, but let's just jump right on in. You know, it's actually kind of an interesting thing as we were preparing for this interview that, Dave, it was almost a year ago in Greeley that we were sitting down at the Pedal the Plains VIP party, and most of us dressed in the VIP portion of that kind of connotation. And here comes Representative Dave Young in spandex and his bike. And you were getting a little bit of a full court press on by former state rep Joe Rice to encourage you to take a look at this race and run for state treasurer back then. I don't know if that was the spur or if you'd had other thoughts about it, but here we are today, and you've survived, come out of the primary and the candidate for the Democratic nomination for state treasurer. Talk a little bit about that journey, the decision to run, the primary process, and then more importantly, share a little bit with our listeners about your background and what you think qualifies you to serve as state treasurer.
Well, thanks, Jeff. We had a few jokes before we went on live here about the Pedal the Plains event and my spandex, so we won't retrace that. But you know, Joe Rice was not the only person to approach me and ask me to consider it. I'd been thinking about it for some time, and frankly thought I had the skill set to bring value to the treasurer's race. Actually, have been approached about running for some other offices as well, and you know, I think it's my experiences over the past 4 years particularly, but my time in the legislature that has really drawn me to the treasurer's race. The last 4 years I've spent on the Joint Budget Committee, bipartisan committee. I'm not sure how many people know exactly what the Joint Budget Committee is or does, but you know, 6 members out of the 100 legislators who work and develop what is now the $30 billion budget for the state of Colorado. Bipartisan, because there's 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and we work well together. And I think we have done some good work in a bipartisan way to govern when it comes to the budget. So that experience and digging deeply into the state's finances, I think, really having a solid understanding of the various challenges that we have in the state of Colorado, and knowing you know, my skill set as a collaborator and my math background and my work in higher ed as well, made me believe that you know, I brought the right skill set in order to be able to do this work. Background-wise, even before I was in the legislature, I taught math, science, and technology at a junior high in Greeley for about 25 years. And I will tell you that that's great preparation for the legislature. Ed can confirm that.
I think you might be giving too much credit to the legislature.
Oh, come on now, Ed. Come on. And so, you know, I really loved that experience. I actually was president of the Teachers Association there in Greeley, chief bargaining spokesperson. We were one of the first local associations to actually move to consensus bargaining back in the 80s. And, you know, that experience actually, I think, developed that skill set that I brought to the legislature that allowed me to reach across the aisle, work on a lot of very tricky and difficult issues, and be a good problem solver. Work across the aisle, get good ideas and bring them together, and pass legislation that actually, I think, makes a difference in the everyday lives of people in the state of Colorado. I may be missing a piece there, Jeff, of what you asked me as far as background and what brings me to the race. Have I covered that well enough for you?
Absolutely, and I think Ed's going to kind of piggyback from there and start to really dive into some of that background, and it's specific to the state treasurer's race. So Ed, I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, and you've given us a good idea of kind of what brought you to this point. But we're always curious how someone's background specifically qualifies them for the state treasurer. In your case, particularly, you've got a background in education, not in financial management, as a lot of the treasurers have come about with. Talk about what you think qualifies you to be the guy in charge of the state's money.
You bet. Well, I think when you take a step back and look at really what the treasurer does and what the position is, it is an elected position. So certainly you want somebody that has an understanding of the financial background of the state and how the finances work in detail, and I have that. But also that person is a representative of the people. And this is why it's an elected position. There's a staff of 30 plus people in the treasurer's office, and I've had this experience on the Joint Budget Committee working with a very similar kind of staff that actually bring the expertise to the table. And of course, you want to understand in a very deep way what goes on with finances, but you don't want to be a micromanager. You hire people that are good, you manage them well, and you make sure that it's clear what the mission is for the office. And I think that's been a very stable staff there at the treasurer's office over a long period of time, and I think that they've performed well. So you don't want a treasurer that's going to step in and micromanage them, but certainly want to have enough knowledge of the finances of the state of Colorado and the way the processes work to make sure they're staying on track. And I think I bring that.
All right.
Let's kind of dive in a little bit into some real specifics about the roles and responsibilities. Given that the number one job is the treasurer's office to manage the state's $6.5 billion in investment, what do you think of the current investment portfolio? And then what would you change, if anything?
Well, there's some pretty tight statutory guidance that is placed on the treasurer's office, and probably rightfully so. You don't want risky investments. You don't want the money to be unavailable at the time that the check comes due. The controller needs to sign the check. The treasurer needs to make sure that money is available and that it's wisely and safely and transparently invested. So, there is a goal here to make sure that the money is available and safe. Certainly you want to be sure that you're getting as good a return on the investment as you can, but at the same time, I'm chuckling because I just noticed we're not timing.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's fine. So, we're getting, I think, fair return on our investment. Of course, we've got a variety of different funds, up to 750 different funds. We have some like the permanent fund that actually has a little more leeway, and we have investment advising that is conducted outside the treasurer's office with that particular fund. And of course there's PERA, and I know we'll get into PERA and talk a little bit about the investment strategies there as well. But just specifically within the treasurer's office, that money that flows through, you have the $30 billion budget, you have the Appropriations Committee, of which I was the chair, along with the Senate Appropriations Committee, actually deciding which bills are funded. And then as the revenue comes in and the bills need to be funded, you want to be sure that money is available and liquid enough that it can be accessible, and when the check is written, the money is there.
And so, in terms of investments, your website mentions you wanting to take money out of Wells Fargo and other banks that break the rules. So how much money are we talking about that is in Wells Fargo right now, first of all? And where would you shift that money to in terms of our investments?
Well, there's, there are, at any given time, different amounts of money in Wells Fargo. I don't know what today's amount is. There's contracts with Wells, there's Fargo, there's contracts with Chase as well. And like I said, that $6.5 billion, that is kind of an average. Money flows in at different rates at different times, and it may balloon up to $7 billion at any given time and less. And so those contracts are split out in order to diversify that portfolio a little bit on the investing, but they're cash funded investments. So I mean cash ready investments. The concept of investing in a bank or company that breaks the rules goes contrary to the first role of the treasurer, and that is to make sure that the money is safe. If you're putting money into a bank or into a company that is breaking the rules, you really can't guarantee that the money is safe. I do believe that Wells Fargo here in Colorado has played well, but we certainly have seen the headlines about Wells Fargo International, and there are very considerable concerns. People in Colorado have certainly experienced some really bad outcomes through mortgage refinance and other stories that have broken about the bank creating accounts that they didn't authorize. I mean, we've seen these kind of things, and in fact, we see Wells Fargo, and I think part of it is public pushback from public entities, but we also see consumer pushback that is modifying their behavior now. We see ads. They were Wells Fargo formed in 1860, I can't remember what the year is, but they're saying reorganized in 2018. So, I admire them for doing that. I hope it's a real culture change in their corporation. But, when we put out an RFP for banking, we want to be sure that the banks that reply are actually not sanctioned, aren't breaking the rules, and the fact that we know if we select one of those banks for banking that, in fact, the money is safe and available.
And so the idea is you'll move the money to just another bank that has not had the history of Wells Fargo.
And it could very well be that Wells Fargo fixes their problems and actually can, on an RFP, demonstrate that they have, in fact, changed the way they conduct business, and they qualify for the RFP as a result. So I'm not ruling them out. I'm just saying that we should be cautious and we should be careful when we invest to make sure that the money is safe.
Okay.
Now, let me follow up on that point. First of all, and thank you for the recognition related to Wells and several of the other banks that are part of the Colorado Business and Business Roundtable National Network. On your website, you actually talk about a pretty revolutionary change about a type of a public bank, which would be a dramatic shift for the Treasurer's Office. Can you explain the rationale for that and what that would look like? Again, is it pretty right turn from current existing policy of the State Treasurer's Office?
Well, this is an issue I think that is not actually new, Jeff, but it's one that did come up on the campaign as we were going along, and it's something that I heard clearly. I talked about the fact that the treasurer is actually an elected official that represents people. So when people come to me and say, you should take a look at this, this is an idea that is worth taking a look at, I'm willing to study it. So what I've said is we should take a deeper look and determine whether or not this is feasible in the state of Colorado. Turns out North Dakota's got a state bank. North Dakota's had a state bank for almost a century. So it's not a new idea. And we know that Colorado is very different than North Dakota in a variety of ways. So in fact, what works in North Dakota may not work in Colorado, but I'm never going to be one that's going to say, well, why should we pursue a different idea? If there is value in taking a look at it, we should at least study it and determine whether it's feasible. I will also say that there have been attempts at public banking in other states, and they have failed. And so we need to understand why that happened. We may not be the same kind of state as these other states that tried it and it didn't work, but we should understand why it failed as well. So there's constitutional changes, I think, that would probably have to be made. There are statutory changes that would have to be made. There's a lot of stakeholder work that you would need to do. And like I said, I've had a history in the legislature of actually taking on tough issues, bringing diverse opinions together, doing a lot of stakeholder work, and really determining whether you can go forward with a plan and an idea or not. So this is what I intend to do. We actually when you think about the issue, what I really hear people saying is we should keep more of our state money here in Colorado and make sure it's invested in public. Our public money is invested right here in Colorado. So this could apply to PERA, could apply to the money that's in the Treasury. Public banking could occur at a variety of different levels. It doesn't have to be state, could be county, could be municipalities that pursue this. But if you take a step back from it and don't put a label on it, I think most of us would agree it would be more productive for the economy of the state of Colorado if we invested more of our public money back into the economy here in the state of Colorado. I think some people think of that as public banking, but it could be any number of ideas. I met with the Colorado Bankers Association representatives and talked through a lot of this. There's bankers banks, there's community banks, we have credit unions, we have a full array of different banking services that are conducted right now. One of the things I think that was interesting about digging a little bit into the North Dakota example is the fact that they've worked out a collaborative relationship with their private banking partners in the state of North Dakota, so they're not in competition with each other. To me, this is an interesting approach. Like I said, North Dakota is not the same as Colorado, but there may be some seeds of how you actually work an idea and actually come to a consensus approach on doing something a little different than what we've tried before. But again, I think it's going to take deep study, and it's going to take bringing everybody together to the table to really talk about it to see whether it's worth pursuing. And
we'll
that's the work
definitely give you credit as a candidate for recognizing North Dakota and Colorado are different. kudos there, Representative Young. Yeah, interesting. Obviously, a little new to Colorado, and it's been tried elsewhere. And I think there's certainly lessons to be learned, good and bad. And so, I appreciate that. And I think it's probably a great transition to start to shift to PERA right now. So I'll let you kind of pick up.
Wanted to ask a follow-up question on that. You mentioned that you wanted to do some studying on it. How long would you do that before you would enact on this?
Well, I think it's a little hard to tell until you actually dig in how long it would take. I have at various times said perhaps it would take a year of study to do that. Again, the issues are complex. So first off, what does the Colorado Constitution tell us we have to do? Do we have to change that? If so, what are the political realities of that? What statutory changes might we have to make? Why are we actually doing this? I think there's some front-end work that always has to be done. I said, take a step back from the bigger picture. Don't put a label of public bank on it necessarily, but I think it's people saying, instead of our money leaving the state, going off to Wall Street, can we keep it here and invest it here? Maybe it takes on different dimensions that send us in a different direction. I can't forecast how long that takes and what those conversations might look like, but I'm willing to engage people to start the process so that we can actually move down the road and make a determination.
Thank you for your clarification. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jeff.
No,
on PERA.
it's a good question.
That's all right. So, yeah, let's, as Jeff mentioned,
I'm kind of used to it.
let's move to PERA now. There's a lot of ways to parse this. So let's start with this basic question. You voted against Senate Bill 200, the PERA reform bill that passed on the final day and the final hour of the legislative session last year. Start by just explaining what you didn't like about it and why you thought taking no action on PERA's $32 billion unfunded liability this year was better than a flawed reform plan.
Well, and you mentioned it, it came in the 11th hour. And let me just back up and talk about that process a little bit, because my vote was based as much on process as anything else. The bill started really well before the session started. There was a lot of conversation about the fact that we knew we needed to do something. The numbers were out there, and action needed to be taken. There was questions about how soon that needed to be done, but we knew that the rating agencies were questioning the sustainability of PERA, and there were threats that we might have a downgrade of our rating. And of course, we don't want that to happen, because that impacts the interest rates that we pay, and this is a direct impact on taxpayers. So, you pay attention to that, and you know that you need to do something. But what is it that needs to be done? There was a lot of dialogue going on as we went along about the various issues that we were going to have to address. And, at some point in this PERA conversation, I'll talk about the big, I'll give you my math teacher explanation of PERA, simple equation, balancing of an equation. But let's talk about the process. So the bill was introduced. There were elements in the Senate bill that I questioned. And, of course, it's a process. So it goes through committee, comes out of the Senate, comes over the House. There were changes that were made in the House. And, there's a process for that as well. So as it went through and it was voted on, there was this conversation about we're pretty sure this has got to go back to conference committee. And so we knew that that was the direction it was going to head. And a conference committee would be formed to work out the differences between the Senate and the House bill. That conference committee did not meet until the morning of the last day of the session. To me, and I don't understand, I have not heard why the delay, but I think that conference committee should have met much sooner to actually work through that, because on the last day at 10 o'clock at night, we had a caucus meeting. The House Dems had a caucus meeting. The governor joined us, and we talked about the conference committee report, but we did not have an actual printed version of the conference committee report that we were going to vote on. At 11 o'clock at night, literally the 11th hour, 10:54 p.m., I think, on the last day of the session when we're supposed to be done at midnight, the machines are open, we're voting. I still didn't have a copy of the conference committee report. We're voting on a document that I don't even have any printed material on. And even beyond that, I did not have the nonpartisan financials, the fiscal note for the bill. I don't do business like that. I want to see what it is I'm voting on. I want to see the nonpartisan financials, and I really want to understand what exactly that vote means, what the implications of the vote are. Certainly there was tension to take a vote and to move this issue forward as rapidly as we could. But, without actually being able to see exactly what we're voting on, I'm a no vote. Now, we still are waiting for a full set of the nonpartisan financials. I did, while I was requesting it that night, get a printed copy of the conference committee report, but I didn't have the full set of the documents I felt I needed to see, to do the due diligence I have to my district up in Greeley to say that I'm a yes vote on something when I can't even see the details.
And I'll start this question now, and this will finish this on the other side of the segment here. But now you know the details in it. What do you like? What do you not like in it?
You bet. Well, we had on the Joint Budget Committee set aside $225 million that was a direct deposit to PERA. And I won't speak for the other members of the Joint Budget Committee, but it was my understanding that this amount of money would grow over time as a percentage of salary, so that this direct deposit would not not result in failure to meet our funding horizon that we're trying to achieve, fully funding in 30 years or less, and wouldn't offload onto the backs of employees and employers. What came out was that $225 million was going to stay static going off into the future, which means as prices and costs rise over time, which we know they will, this doesn't keep up. And so the compromise that came out was that employees over a period of 2 years are going to ratchet up to a 2% higher contribution than they're paying now. And employers, I think it's 0.25%. And we'll come back. I'm doing your job, Alex, but when we come back,
yes.
I'll talk a little bit about why that's a bigger problem in the outlook. And then I'm concerned about COLA, and I'm concerned about some of the other features that were in there as well. We can come back and talk about those.
Well, Dave, you wrapped it up quite nicely for me.
I'm not trying to take your job,
no
Alex.
worries. That's quite all right. You got a bigger job you're running for.
There you go.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll be right back here on Connect and Collaborate. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page while you're here. And stay tuned with us here on Connect and Collaborate. We'll be right back with Dave Young, Democratic candidate for state treasurer. Stay with us. Welcome back to Connect and Collaborate. We have with us Dave Young. He is the Democratic candidate for state treasurer for our Colorado Election Watch series. Again, we have Ed Sealiver with Denver Business Journal in studio as well, and Jeff Wasden, Covert president, on the phone. We're just going to jump right back in. We left off with a PERA question. We'll get right back into that answer.
Take it away, Jeff.
Yeah, one of the questions that I wanted to check in with first and foremost is kind of your views of the current state treasurer, Walker Stapleton, and how you think he's running that office. And I want to put it in the context of one of the many spoils if you win this state treasurer's race is a coveted seat on the PERA board. It gives you an opportunity and a voice on the platform, and using that as a backdrop with your views of the current state treasurer, how would you use that seat to either be more effective, to work differently with that PERA board, and continuing to kind of push for the changes that you feel are needed to ensure the future sustainability of the PERA system?
Well, Jeff, and you're couching this in terms of, Walker Stapleton's work on the PERA board, I think specifically. I think it's been contentious, and it's a difficult situation for that board because they are caught between a pension system that needs to be effective and a legislature that actually makes decisions about how it's funded and benefits are structured. So, there's 16 members on there. The treasurer is one voice out of the 16. So, in fact, you want to be sure that you've got somebody on there that will be collaborative. I've already articulated the fact that that's my mode of operation. I work very diligently to bring people together, to be a problem solver. We clearly have a problem with PERA. I think it's instructive to understand where that problem really started, because I think a lot of times, what I've heard coming from the current treasurer is kind of a narrow scope of where the problem originated. But I look back to the early 2000s, late 1990s, when PERA was overfunded, was at 105%. And I think the question needs to be asked, how could we go from a pension that was overfunded to the state that we're in today? And there were some decisions that were made early on in those years that panned out to be not the best decisions. So there was an effort to try to downsize government by encouraging people to retire early, and that the way that was done was to provide people with an option to buy additional years of service credit. They weren't buying them at normal cost. They weren't matched by employer match, and what we ended up with is a fund that started to get into trouble. And you can see the graph. You can see I think the Denver Post had a nice graph that showed the downward slide from the year 2000 to where we are today. It certainly wasn't the only factor. There are other factors in the performance of the portfolio that entered into that. And that goes back to my mathematical sheets that's there, that mathematical balance that we have to strike. But, if we aren't careful with the decisions that are made, and this is why the treasurer needs to work carefully with the legislature, you can have dramatic impacts on how PERA functions. So that particular decision back in the 2000s actually encouraged people to retire early, which means, in fact, people are getting paid benefits longer than was originally anticipated through the actuarial work that PERA was doing. And the fact that they weren't actually contributing the full freight of normal cost in that, it wasn't employer matched, meant that the pension was going to get into some trouble. And so it's never been clear to me what percentage of the trouble is attributed to that bad decision, but and I'm not sure it's easy to calculate. But I think we would have weathered the recessions in the last decade much more effectively had we not made those decisions then. So, I'm fine with a treasurer who calls out a problem and says, let's be a problem solver and let's work together. Just being critical, I don't think helps. I think it ends up polarizing people. It politicizes the process and doesn't bring people together to actually come to a solution on it. I admire the work that the PERA board has done. I think their staff has worked diligently to come up with options. Those are the ones that we looked at as part of the Senate Bill 200 beginnings back before session started. So I think they're really actively trying to make sure that we are in a problem-solving mode. I'm a PERA member, so is my wife. You know, we're both educators, and so very intensely want to make sure that we have a sustainable defined benefit plan going forward for the people in PERA. This benefits not just the PERA members, but it benefits the entire state of Colorado in a number of ways. So we've got to work. We've got to come together and figure this out. The treasurer should be a positive voice in that process of how do we actually come to a good conclusion on this that not only benefits the members, but also benefits the entire state of Colorado.
And let me ask, you were starting to mention things you were not happy with or details in Senate Bill 200. Right. Obviously, you're just one vote on the PERA board. You also will have a voice with the legislature if you get elected treasurer. What changes would you push for using your voice at this point?
You bet. Well, I think we need to revisit the amount of direct deposit that I talked about earlier. The Joint Budget Committee had set forward this $225 million, and of course that's can be changed in any legislative session by the Joint Budget Committee making a recommendation to the legislature through the long bill. Certainly, again, the original idea was that that amount of money was going to grow as a percentage of salary so that it would keep pace with cost of living. And by setting it as a flat amount that stays $225 million going forward, really does change the calculus of the equation, the balance of the equation that we have to achieve. So I think that's one area that we need to revisit. I'm concerned about the COLA. I'm concerned about the COLA, the cost of living adjustment. And I'll tell you why I'm concerned about that, because if you are a valued member, and I'll just use an example of a team approach in our schools. But, we have a big team. You have educators, you have administrators, but you also have people like custodians and cooks and bus drivers and secretaries who don't necessarily work in high-paying jobs in the district, but they're valued members of the team in that district and in that school. And if they don't make a lot of money, they're not going to actually have a very high-paying benefit structure coming out of PERA. They're riding the line sometimes between sustainability and poverty. And if the cost of living adjustment that is coming out of the legislature really doesn't keep them in the sustainability category, then they're going to fall into poverty. What does that mean? Well, that means that you've got people in an undignified retirement that are actually having to rely on food stamps, maybe housing support, maybe Medicaid as well as Medicare. Who's paying for those safety net services? Taxpayers. So I think sometimes we get into a very narrow view of these things, and it's kind of like a balloon. You squeeze on one end and a problem pops out on the other. You have to take a step back and really look at the big picture that PERA is just part of a total compensation package for our state employees, educators, and other public servants that are here in the state of Colorado. And if we don't have a sustainable plan that moves them forward into the future in retirement, then we end up offloading the problem onto taxpayers in other ways, which is not really good planning or good thoughtful business sense in my mind. So we have that concern. I've looked into the idea of a means-tested COLA. I think that's pretty difficult to do, but I'm willing to take a good hard look at that. I think Social Security is actually looking at the idea of capping benefits, and it might be something that we'd want to look there. These are all politically laden kinds of solutions that need to really be fully vetted and need to be sure that the PERA members and taxpayers and legislators and large groups of folks and that are affected are brought to the table and listened to very carefully as we try to figure out a pathway through that. But these, if you just look narrowly at PERA and narrowly at the equation, and the equation is this: if the amount of money that is being put into PERA is less than the amount of money being paid out in the way of benefits, then the equation doesn't balance. You're going to run into trouble. And this is where we've run into trouble with PERA now, is because of some of these decisions and where these contributions come from. They're employee contributions, they're employee contributions, employee, employer, and then portfolio return on investment. And if that input is less than the benefits that we're paying out, the balance of the equation is out of whack, and we see that play out over the last 20 years in PERA right now. So, twisting the knobs of the equation without actually considering the real people that are affected by those changes lead us to problems down the line. And it's not just a mechanical process here. You really have to actually consider the effects on people when you make these changes.
Now, let me follow up then with a very specific question. I think you've been public in wanting PERA to divest from companies associated with the NRA and the gun industry. What's your rationale for doing that? What do you think the effects on the PERA investment would be? And then are there other areas from which you think PERA should be divested from?
So I was in the 2013 session when we took those tough votes on the gun bills. And so we've seen dramatic events in Colorado and across the nation. We had the Aurora Theater shooting, Columbine, the event up in the mountains, Platte. I'm forgetting the name of the school district up there, but I mean, we've had our own events up here in Colorado, and we've seen them across the nation as well. What I have seen from the NRA and from the gun manufacturing industry is what I would classify as fear-mongering. And I see it in my constituents in Greeley, that people who believe that something is going to happen, that law enforcement is going to come and take their guns away, a mischaracterization of the work that we did in the legislature just to scare people into buying more guns, to me is not the kind of corporate partner that we want to have and invest in as a state. If the NRA and the gun manufacturing industry want to come to the table and actually work with the rest of the legislature and the communities to actually come up with good problem solving around this, I'm certainly welcome to that. What leverage we can do in the portfolio is pretty minimal. There's not a lot of money invested in the gun manufacturing industry to do that, but I think, and I think I speak for a pretty large majority of the people of Colorado, that we would like to see better solutions that keep our schools safe, keep our communities safe. We had a great bill in the legislature this past session that Representative Garnett and Representative Cole Wist were championing in the House, a bipartisan bill to actually make sure that people who are a danger to themselves or others don't have access to guns. And that bill didn't get through the legislature. I believe that that might have a different pathway if our gun manufacturing industry and the NRA actually came to the table in a way that said, we're going to actually be a part of this problem-solving process and make that happen. Does a change in our portfolio actually make that occur? Probably not. Does it send a message to them that we would like them to do it in a different way? I believe so. And we had this conversation about Wells Fargo actually reacting to not only public pressure, maybe from different entities, public entities threatening to not invest in them, but also consumers pushing back and saying, look, your business practices aren't really appropriate, and we're not going to continue to invest unless you change your practices. So I think that there's some pressure that can be played. That is a complicated process that needs to be fully vetted. This is why you have a board, a PERA board. You don't have one person who's making decisions there. And in fact, you have a set of members of PERA who actually also weigh in on that as well, and then you have taxpayers who need to weigh in on it. So it's something that I think needs to be a talking point and it needs to be a discussion, a frank discussion about how we move our state forward in effective ways.
And speaking of discussions, some past treasurers have had very open relationships with the legislature, worked closely with them. Some have chosen not to. What kind of relationship, if you're a treasurer, would you like to have with your soon-to-be former colleagues in the legislature? And are there particular pieces of legislation that you would like to push as treasurer, or that you would really like to work closely with the legislatures advising them on?
Right. I think I bring a skill set to the office that maybe some of the other treasurers did not have with this work that I've done on the Joint Budget Committee and a very aggressive legislative work that I've done over the last 7 years. My concern is that we aren't investing in ourselves as a state, and as a result, we aren't able to move forward. And we can see this play out in very severe underfunding of our K-12 public schools. We know we have a transportation system that is under stress. We have human services and a higher education system, healthcare system. Every aspect of our budget's in stress. And I think that the treasurer ought to take a lead role in working with the legislature to say, how do we problem solve so that we can actually have an effective government that meets the needs of the constituents and the citizens of the state of Colorado. The treasurer doesn't actually run bills. Right?
Certainly, yes.
That's the legislature's job. But the treasurer certainly can help facilitate stakeholder work, can actually seek out and support legislators who are coming forward with good ideas that would actually move the state forward, and work with the Joint Budget Committee, which actually, when they come together and have a unanimous vote on a bill, carries a lot of weight, and it moves through the legislature. Not always, but usually pretty rapidly and pretty successfully. So I'm going to leverage those relationships and work with people and listen carefully to the ideas that they bring to the table. And when they're effective ideas, I'm going to get behind them. If there's ideas that I think are going to cause trouble in the state of Colorado, if they go through in the form they are, I'm going to weigh in on that as well in a problem-solving way. I'm specifically, and I'm coming from some of the work that we did. When I say we, the six of us on the Joint Budget Committee, to actually try to be more effective in the way that we approach problem solving in the state. And let me specifically talk about something that actually started in the governor's office with results first. It's an effort to actually do a better job of identifying outcomes that we want to achieve, measuring whether or not we're achieving those outcomes, and deciding whether the work that's being done in a particular department, in a particular program, is actually effective. And then having the dialogue about, well, what will we do with that then? Should we eliminate that program? Should we actually expand it and fund it differently, direct it in different ways? How can we produce better outcomes? And what I've discovered a lot of times is if you actually get people the services they need when they need them, you get better outcomes. Now, I'm not talking about things they want. I'm talking about things that citizens need. When people get the services they need when they need them, their outcomes are better, and amazingly, we often save money in the process because we are actually forestalling or getting on the front end of a problem and solving it. So I think this results first work that Henry Sobonet and the Office of State Planning and Budgeting did was stellar, and we ought to continue to work on that. I also think that there was some work that Donna Lynn did in her office as Chief Executive Officer. She set up a dashboard, brought people together to actually start to identify outcomes for the different departments in the state of Colorado and metrics that we were going to take a look at to determine whether or not we were hitting those outcomes well. And we're doing that as a Joint Budget Committee even. We're going back through with the help of the Auditor's Office, and we're analyzing each of the tax breaks that we have in the state of Colorado to determine how effective those are. These aren't efforts to try to be political or undercut. These are efforts to actually serve the citizens of the state of Colorado more effectively by actually talking about facts and how and outcomes and what people really need. And I think the treasurer can't do this alone, but I think the treasurer ought to take a lead role in making sure that that happens. So if the next administration doesn't pick up on what Donald Lynn had started in the Lieutenant Governor's office, I'd be happy to pluck that out of there and put it in the Treasurer's office. If it requires legislation, I will work with legislators in order to actually make sure that we move the state forward in productive ways.
Hey, I want to pick right up on that exact theme that you were talking about, really related to the role of the Treasurer's office. On your website, you talk about getting more funding for schools, fighting for progressive values, for example, universal health care. How do you see those fitting into your role as a state treasurer? How do you use that office to fight for things that are important to you?
Oh, we've seen treasurers going back some time that are activist treasurers that use the bully pulpit of the office to highlight issues. And, I think back to Carrie Kennedy and her work with the BEST program, the Building Excellent Schools Today program. Fantastic work. We have a really difficult situation in rural Colorado with our schools. I had an up-close look at this. I traveled around the state actually before I thought about getting into the race. Went around the state with the Colorado Association of School Boards. And we have a crisis in our rural Colorado. If you're out on the Eastern Plains, if you're down in the southeast corner of the state, La Junta, Lamar, or in the valley, Alamosa, you work your way up through all the mountain towns on the western slope that are not resort towns, there's a crisis. There's a crisis in Greeley. We have a really severe situation where we are not able to meet the real needs of students. And so some of that is on the operational side. We have about a $7.3 billion hole in the school's budget across the state as a result of a technique that the legislature has used for 10 years called the negative factor, or the budget stabilization factor, of actually providing money according to Amendment 23 and then pulling the money back again to balance the budget. And it's created this $7.3 billion hole. The work that Carrie Kennedy did out of the Treasurer's office in concert with the legislature was to create this capital construction program called BEST, Building Excellent Schools Today, that we utilize very effectively in order to meet the needs of school repair and construction. The problem is the hole is $18 billion. That's the guesstimate as to what that shortfall is, and we aren't able to actually meet the real needs of that. So we have students in life safety situations, dangerous situations that need to be rectified, and we don't have the funding to do that, and we don't have an operational side that's able to meet the real needs of students either. So we can talk in theory about the issues that the treasurer should address, but I'm interested in the real problems that we have in the state of Colorado. We need to connect the budget and the work of the treasurer's office to the real needs of the state of Colorado and be sure that every citizen in the state of Colorado, every student that needs support, is able to get it regardless of their zip code.
And let me talk about one more issue the Treasurer will face, and that is one of the more public faces of the Treasurer, the Great Colorado Payback Program. How do you think that is run right now? Are there any changes that you would make to it?
I think some changes are actually underway. I've actually had a couple of instances where I've had money or a property that was there, or my family did. And, I've heard from constituents that they've had good experiences, but I've also heard from some constituents that said it took a long time to get their property back. I've even had some treasurers from the state of Colorado and counties that have said that their property is being held and they're having to prove that they're a county in order to get it back. And I'm a little mystified as to why that's happening. I do know that the people that manage that particular program are instituting new technologies, and that the processes may be streamlined. So I want to take a good look at that and make sure that those implementations, those technology implementations, are being done the right way.
And before we go off air, if you will tell us how we can get a hold of you.
You bet. Well, website is daveyoungforcolorado.com. That's the word for, F-O-R, not the number 4. You'd think the treasurer might put a number in there, but no, it's daveyoungforcolorado.com. Email addresses and phone numbers are there on the website, and more information about policy stances are there. I'm always happy to interact with people and respond to questions that they may have. So I encourage you to go check it out and be in touch.
Well, thanks, Dave. Best of luck to you in the race. Again, if you missed yesterday's episode, check it out at cobrt.com/radio-podcast, and we will be back at the end of August with Secretary of State candidates. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.